from the landing to where the body was, partway down, hidden under a small tree, was this bag of clothing. Well, that clothing that was found was actually just up the hill, right up in there. It was a pair of pants, a pair of underwear, shirt, socks, shoes.
Polk County Jane Doe. In September 1996, a father and son out hunting discovered skeletal remains wrapped in a tarp in the hills of Polk County, Oregon. These were later determined to be an adult female based on the observation of the wide pelvis bone. Her body had been wrapped in a tarp. A bag containing men's clothes was found near her body, containing a pair of pants, underwear, a shirt, socks, and shoes. On the underwear, there was a semen stain, a crucial clue to the investigators. But it yielded no DNA matches when it was run through any databases. Authorities hit a dead end when they were not able to determine a cause of death or even who the victim was. However, the case had been deemed a homicide based on the manner in which the body was disposed of. Looking at the skeletal remains, forensic investigators determined her age to be early 40s. Her physical stature was small, indicating her height to be around 5 feet. Examining her hip bones, they determined that she had given birth at least once. The analysis also revealed that she would have had a cranial surgery at some point. Without any information to go on, investigators were unable to identify the deceased woman. With no real name to give to her, she was called Polk County Jane Doe. She was eventually laid to rest in an unmarked grave and was entered in the NamUs database. Sketches of what she may have looked like while alive were developed with only her bones to base them on. Everything from CT scans to 3D rendered images were used in an attempt to put a face on the Jane Doe, but to no avail. At one point, the actual skull of the Jane Doe was used to create a lifelike sculpture, but that too returned no results. The case remained cold until 2019, when Yolanda McClary, a retired crime scene investigator, reached out to the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, offering her assistance and expertise while working on a TV show. Later the same year, genetic genealogists working with McClary were able to develop a DNA profile and uploaded it to an open-source genealogy website. The case, and the process of identifying the remains, was featured in Oxygen's The Jane Doe Murders. From there, the goal was to hit a possible match, which they eventually did. Her name was Kathy Buxton. Kathy was around the same age as Jane Doe and had been living near the area where the crime occurred. Investigators then successfully located Kathy's biological sister, Linda Amsler. McClary convinced her to provide her DNA to conclude once and for all if the Jane Doe was indeed Kathy. The results confirmed it. Kathy Buxton was finally given her name back after all these years. Born Kathy G. Thomason on December 13, 1953, to parents Leo and Jessie Thomas in Oklahoma, she was the youngest of 3 sisters. When their parents separated, Kathy relocated with her father to Oregon, while her older sisters, Sandra and Linda, were adopted in Oklahoma. Sometime after that, Kathy was also adopted by a woman named Aileen Buxton, thus officially becoming Kathy Buxton. Linda hadn't seen her sister in decades after she was adopted. At 18, Kathy became pregnant and then married her first husband, Carl Tracy. Within a year, Kathy's first daughter, Tina, was born, but the couple divorced shortly thereafter. Just a few months later, she married her second husband, James Gardner, with whom she had 2 more children, James Jr. and Candace. However, she soon divorced Gardner and moved to Oklahoma with the kids. Eventually, she lost custody of the children after leaving them unattended on multiple occasions. The children had no contact with each other after being removed from their home. They were only reunited after her mother's body was identified. McClary also reunited them with their aunt, Linda. After Kathy's children were taken, she moved to Portland, Oregon, where she met her third husband, Brian Clifton, in 1984. Presumably unbeknownst to Kathy, Clifton had a few skeletons in his closet already. In 1973, Clifton was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of a female motel employee who he claimed stole $65 from him. Clifton strangled her to death with the electrical cord from a vacuum cleaner. Shockingly, he was paroled just 8 years later in 1981. He returned to Portland, where he met Kathy. As the investigation proceeded, it was discovered that Kathy's last verified contact with anyone was in March 1996, when she reported a hit and run to Salem police where she lived with Clifton. Investigators discovered that Clifton had never reported her missing. Even more suspicions were aroused when they found out that he had remarried shortly after Kathy's disappearance. No doubt Clifton was their number one suspect, yet detectives needed to make sure that they had concrete proof against him. They took a DNA sample from him and compared it to the one taken from the underwear that was found at the crime scene. There was a match. Things moved fairly quickly after that. Clifton initially denied any involvement, but when questioned by authorities in 2020, he finally confessed to brutally stabbing his wife to death in her sleep. In August 2021, he was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. In 2022, 69-year-old Brian Clifton was sentenced to life in prison. Finally, after 26 years, justice prevailed for Kathy Buxton. Garfield County Jane Doe. On April 20, 1998, two men traveling down a two-lane Utah highway came across an unidentified body of a deceased female. It was found 38 miles from Lake Powell on Utah Highway 276 near Maidenwater Springs in Garfield County, Utah. When the deputies from Garfield County Sheriff's Office reached the scene, they found her frozen body had been tied up, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, placed in a sleeping bag, and then rolled up into a children's rug, which had a design of houses and roadways with children playing. Her fingertips had been removed so that investigators could not identify her by fingerprint. With brown hair and brown eyes, the deceased woman was believed to be of Hispanic or Native American descent. She was a petite woman, only 5 feet tall, and weighed about 112 pounds. She had multiple dental restorations, tattooed eyebrows, freckles on her face, and several small moles, dark moles on her upper lip, chin, and left shoulder, and she also had a distinctive mole on her right ear. The cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound to the head. Thankfully, the freezing cold weather in Maidenwater helped in preserving the body. Although the deceased woman's face was identifiable, detectives could not identify her as she did not match any known missing persons in the area. The victim soon became known as the Maidenwater victim, or Garfield County Jane Doe. She appeared to be between 37 to 45 years old. However, despite being in a good condition, the body offered little to no information to point to an identification. Additionally, there were no witnesses due to the remote location where her body was dumped. Police turned to the public and urged them to come forward if they had any information or insights. The victim's DNA was entered into NamUs, a missing person database. To assist with the investigation, the Utah Department of Public Safety's State Bureau of Investigation provided analytical resources to the Garfield County Sheriff's Office, but even those fell short. The case grew cold despite relentless efforts from all those involved. Over the years, many composite sketches were released to the public in hopes that someone would come forward with crucial details, but no one did. For years, Garfield County Jane Doe laid in an unmarked grave. Several theories were formed in the passing years regarding the last days of Jane Doe's life. In the initial investigation, serial killer Scott Kimball, who's referred to as the Hannibal Killer, was considered a suspect in the murder. Kimball's responsible for at least 4 murders, but is suspected in as many as 21 deaths. The reasoning behind this was the way in which the Maidenwater victim's body was found. It matched Kimball's M.O., even to the point of using the children's rug for dumping the body. Allegedly, he confessed to killing a hitchhiker in 1998, just 10 miles away from where Jane Doe's body had been found. He was on his way to attend a family reunion in nearby Bryce Canyon. His former wife and son stated that they had seen Kimball buying a children's rug similar to the one used to wrap Jane Doe. For years, Kimball remained the top suspect in this case, but he denied any connection to this murder. However, with a lack of evidence to connect him to the murder, he was later ruled out as a suspect. It wasn't until 2018 that any notable progress was made in the case. In 2018, Utah authorities decided to release a not-so-graphic post-mortem photo of the victim's face. Coincidentally, that same week, police in Youngstown, Ohio were updating their missing persons cases and included a photo of Lina Reyes Geddes from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This was the first photo of her that they were able to obtain. Yet it wasn't either of these agencies that would solve this mystery, It was an internet sleuth who originally made the critical connection between the two newly released photographs. A true crime buff from California began to connect the dots after seeing two pictures on the internet. Indeed, the two pictures looked very similar when it came to facial features. The most telling clue, though, was the mole on the missing person's right ear, just as Jane Doe had. Once the connection was made, detectives put out efforts to track down the missing woman's relatives. Her name was Lina Reyes Geddes. She was born in a small town in Mexico in 1960. Despite being a small-town girl, Lina had big aspirations. She was an accomplished ballerina who later earned a degree in international business. Educated and talented, Lina was the shining star of her family. In 1996, she met Edward Geddes in New Mexico, and they were married just 6 months later. The couple moved to Ohio shortly after to start a new life. Just 2 years after that, in 1998, Lina would go missing. She was supposed to fly to Mexico to meet her family from her home in Youngstown, Ohio, by way of Texas. In a filmed interview regarding his missing wife in October 1998, Edward told state investigators that he last saw her when he dropped her off at the airport in Pittsburgh on the morning of April 8, 1998. She was carrying a suitcase, a cosmetics case, and a blue sleeping bag that was meant to be a gift for a young cousin. She was supposed to arrive in Dallas 2 days later, but she never made it. Family members grew concerned when nobody heard from her for a week. However, her husband never reported her missing. A missing persons report was filed by an aunt who lived in Mexico 5 months after Lina vanished. To confirm the identity of the maiden water victim, police sent out a media release asking for family or anyone who may have information to contact them. Shortly after, Lina's sister, Lucero Reyes, who was living in Mexico, called in. She was just 11 years old when her sister went missing. Lucero traveled 300 miles from Mexico to the nearest U.S. consulate where authorities collected DNA samples from her. The match came back identifying the Garfield County Jane Doe as Lina Reyes Geddes. She was no longer identified by the place where her body was dumped. Lucero was very grateful to the investigators who never stopped working on her sister's case. But the work was still not done, as the investigators still had to find the person responsible for Lina's death. With improvements in DNA forensics technology, in 2019, a crime scene investigator was able to extract DNA samples from one of the ropes that had bound Lina's body. The sample matched 2 different individuals. The first one was linked to a knot expert that Utah police had consulted in the case, who had inadvertently contaminated the rope with his own DNA. However, the other sample led to someone who was no stranger, her own husband, Edward Geddes. Apparently, Lina's family in Mexico had always suspected that Edward had something to do with his wife's disappearance, but couldn't prove it. Investigators in Garfield County Sheriff's Office believed that there was circumstantial evidence present which pointed towards Edward, but nothing had been done about it. As for why Lina's body was dumped in Utah when she was supposed to travel to Texas, authorities can only speculate. They theorized that he had traveled 1,800 miles to dump the body because he had no known ties to the area, and it could be difficult to connect the crime to him. Although the conclusion finally came after 24 years, the monster would elude justice by killing himself in 2001 in Nevada, just 3 years after Lina's death. In June of 2022, the case was officially closed after Edward Geddes was formally named as his wife's killer. Rising Fawn Jane Doe. On Friday, December 16, 1988, around 2 p.m., the Dade County Sheriff's Office and the GBI responded to a call regarding a body found about 5 miles from the Alabama state line on I-59 near Rising Fawn in Dade County, Georgia. 2 state transportation workers discovered the woman's body along the side of the northbound lane. The body belonged to an unidentified female who was wearing a navy blue thermal knit pullover, a navy blue bra, Calvin Klein jeans, and black lace-up size 9 ankle boots. She was also wearing a pinkish-white ring topped with a heart on the pinky finger of her left hand and a small yellow-gold chain around her neck. There was not much evidence present at the crime scene. Investigators were unable to identify the woman, as no ID was found on or near the body. An autopsy concluded that she was sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Investigators believed that she was murdered elsewhere and her body had been dumped at the scene where it was later located. It was believed that her body had been disposed of several days to a week before she was discovered. Bodily fluid containing an unknown individual's DNA was also found at the scene. No doubt it was a homicide, but every effort to either identify the poor victim or her assailant would prove to be unsuccessful. Known by the name Rising Fawn Jane Doe, she would be laid to rest in an unmarked grave in the Dade County graveyard. In an effort to identify her, a composite sketch was made and descriptions of her physical features were made public. She was a Caucasian woman with shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair with frosted ends. She stood between 5'6" to 5'8" and weighed between 120 to 125 pounds. Despite that, no clues would turn up in the ensuing years, and the case remained cold. In the passing years, the GBI forensic artist made clay renderings along with several composites to increase the chances of identifying her, to no avail. Over the years, new age-progressed composites and lifelike clay renderings were created, yet none led to any revelations regarding the deceased woman's identity. The case was reopened in the mid-2000s, and that's when investigators found additional evidence that could possibly identify the victim. The evidence was sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for testing. Analysts were then able to develop a DNA profile for the victim, which was entered into the missing person's DNA database, yet the case remained unsolved. In 2015, the GBI approached the FBI about the possibility of using new DNA technology. By then, the advancements in DNA technology brought new hope to unfolding the mystery of the unidentified woman. The evidence was sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for further testing. In 2019, her age range was adjusted to 25 to 35. Before this, she was believed to be much younger, around 16, and a possible runaway. In 2021, a Texas-based DNA lab, Othram Inc., was brought in by investigators to assist on the cold case. Using forensic-grade genome sequencing, DNA extraction was performed on the victim's skeletal remains, which resulted in a comprehensive genealogical profile building. From that profile, FBI agents in Atlanta and Baltimore constructed a family tree and tracked down distant relatives of the victim through extensive genealogical research. After 34 years, Rising Fawn Jane Doe finally got her name back. They ultimately identified her as Stacey Lynn Chahorski. Stacey was a former Michigan resident and was hitchhiking at the time of her death. Her last contact with family was on September 15, 1988, when Stacey's mother spoke to her by telephone. Stacey told her mother that she was in North Carolina and planned to make her way back to Michigan. Being a free-spirited girl, Stacey always liked to travel. Although her mother warned her against hitchhiking, she did not heed her advice. She was never heard from again. She was just 19 years old when she went missing. Stacey's mother grew concerned when she did not hear from her. She filed a missing person report with the Norton Shores Police Department in Michigan on January 17, 1989. However, no one had a clue that she had been the victim of a horrendous murder. While Stacey's mother, Mary Beth Smith, got some peace in finally knowing her daughter's fate, investigators were still not finished. Now the hunt was on for her murderer. Investigators decided to use the same DNA technology that gave Stacey her name back to unmask her killer. Ortham Labs began their search in 2021. A male DNA profile that was developed from evidence at the original 1988 crime scene hit a match in June. After an extensive search through 2 databases, Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, forensic analysts were finally able to track down relatives of a man named Henry Haas Wise in 2022, 6 months after Stacey's identification. DNA taken from the family of Henry Wise conclusively identified him as Stacey's murderer. Wise was 34 years old at the time of the murder. He worked as a truck driver for a Western Carolina trucking company. His normal route had him driving through Chattanooga to Birmingham and then to Nashville. He also worked as a stunt driver. Investigators believe that Wise picked Stacey up while she was hitchhiking. He had an extensive criminal history in Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, ranging from theft and assault to obstruction of a police officer. Despite that, his DNA was not in the criminal database, and his arrests predated a mandatory DNA sample following any felony arrest. However, Wise would not be arrested and charged with the murder. In 1999, Wise was burned to death in a stunt car accident. This was the first time that both the victim and her killer had been identified using genetic genealogy, inaugurating a new path toward the future. El Dorado Jane Doe. On July 10, 1991, a woman was found shot to death in room 121 of the Whitehall Motel in El Dorado, Arkansas. According to witnesses, the attacker, an African-American male, fled the scene in his car, which was parked at the hotel parking lot, with a gun in his hand. By the time authorities reached the motel, the assailant was gone. In the motel room, a Caucasian woman was lying dead in a pool of blood. She was wearing a white t-shirt, acid-washed jeans with a black belt, white ankle-length socks, and white tennis shoes. It was believed that she was between the ages of 18 to 30, stood between 5'10 to 5'11, and weighed about 162 pounds. She had freckles on her face and a birthmark under her left breast. She wore a gold-colored chain bracelet on her right wrist and had respectively 2 and 3 piercings in her left and right ear. Persistent bruises on her body indicated that she likely had been a victim of physical abuse for a long time before her death. An autopsy performed on the victim's body confirmed that she had died as a result of a gunshot wound to the head. It was also noted that she had a broken neck. The woman was quickly identified as Cheryl Ann Wick, according to a photo ID found at the crime scene. Now, investigators had only one task: to find her killer. It did not take long to identify the killer, James McAlphin. He turned himself into the police, claiming that the victim had died by suicide. However, he later pleaded guilty to a charge of second-degree murder. He narrowly avoided the first-degree murder charge and only served 15 years for the killing. The case seemed an open-and-shut case. Yet, in a bizarre twist, investigators soon learned that Cheryl Ann Wick was not dead, but rather very much alive. Cheryl was living with her parents in Minneapolis. She had no clue that she was being named as a homicide victim in Arkansas. This, of course, raised the question: if Cheryl was alive, then who was the murdered woman? The answer would not come until 31 years later. Investigators concluded that the deceased had stolen Cheryl's identity. The real Cheryl explained that her social security number and ID cards were stolen while she was working as a dancer at a Minneapolis club called Party Time. Unfortunately, this information did not give them much to go on. Unable to identify her, investigators would refer to her as El Dorado Jane Doe. This was a unique situation, to say the least, having a killer behind bars while his victim remained unidentified. Desperate to solve the case, investigators turned to the killer himself for information. However, as the sick individual McAlphin is, he refused to reveal anything without money in exchange. However, over time, detectives would come to believe that even McAlphin had no idea who she really was, since he only referred to her as Mercedes. It seems that every lead they followed up on only left them with more questions than answers. A Bible was found in Jane Doe's possession that contained several names of the Stroud family. Further investigation determined that they were an African-American family living in Irving, Texas, who had taken her in for a while without knowing her true identity. The case kept getting more and more perplexing and mysterious. No one knew her true identity, just her numerous names: Mercedes, Cheryl Kaufman, Kelly Lee Carr, Shannon, or Sharon Wiley. And with those different names came different stories. To some people, she said she used to be a stripper, was from out of town, and had 2 kids raised by her mother with whom she did not get along. To others, she claimed to be in the witness protection program and said that her father was in the mafia. Some people heard that she was wanted for bank robberies on the East Coast, while some thought she was on the run for the murder of a truck driver. But none of those stories would reveal her true identity. For 3 decades, she was known only as El Dorado Jane Doe. In 2018, nearly 3 decades later, Yolanda McClary, a forensic genealogy researcher and crime scene investigator, teamed up with local law enforcement to help identify Jane Doe. After extensive DNA profile work, from that profile, working through a family tree, Yolanda and her team were finally able to track down a distant cousin of Jane Doe using GEDmatch. In 2022, El Dorado Jane Doe finally got her name back. The woman was identified only as Kelly. Her last name is kept hidden to respect her family's privacy. Kelly was born in 1968 in Virginia out of wedlock. Her mother Brenda never let her biological father know about her existence. Kelly grew up only knowing her stepfather as her dad. Kelly also had a younger sister. In 1972, when Brenda divorced her husband, Kelly was just 4 years old. Brenda remarried and divorced 2 more times after that. After 3 failed marriages, Brenda moved to Virginia Beach, while her daughters were sent to stay with an aunt. After about a year, Kelly went to stay with her mother. She began working at a beach jewelry kiosk after dropping out of school in 10th grade. Life was not easy for Kelly. Her mother's drug addiction and stealing became a serious problem. It never got better, and Kelly developed a cocaine addiction herself. In 1986, at the age of 18, she moved to Little Rock, Arkansas from Florida. After spending roughly 3 years there, she left the city in 1989. That marked the first of many relocations over the years. In 1989, Kelly moved back to Florida to stay with her younger sister, and the sisters stayed together until 1990 when Kelly decided to go to Virginia. In 1991, Kelly left Virginia and moved to Dallas, which is where she met McAlpin. Later that same year, Kelly moved to El Dorado, Arkansas, where her journey would end. Kelly met McAlpin at a dance club where she was working as a dancer sometime after moving to Dallas. She was also working at the Kentucky Fried Chicken in Dallas. The relationship was tumultuous and abusive from the start. During the entire span of their relationship, she was in and out of the emergency room to treat the injuries inflicted by McAlpin. He even started to pimp her out for money. When the situation deteriorated further, her friends, along with local police, tried to get her out of the relationship. Finally, in June 1991, Kelly was able to break away from McAlpin and moved in with one of her female friends, but she was still scared of him and wondered what he might do to her. Her fears came true on July 10, 1991. Although McAlpin had repeatedly threatened to kill her, assuming she was seeing someone else, Kelly still decided to meet him when he promised her some money. She walked the short distance to the Whitehall Motel from her friend's apartment. According to witnesses, an argument broke out right after Kelly entered the room where McAlpin was waiting for her. After a struggle, she somehow fled through the door and ran toward the parking lot, only to be taken down by McAlpin. He dragged her back to the room and shut the door behind him. Moments after that, a gunshot could be heard from the room, and McAlpin fled the scene as soon as he realized that Kelly was dead. Although Kelly never had regular contact with her family, they tried to get in touch with her over the years and wondered about her whereabouts. However, nobody ever formally reported her missing, which gravely contributed to the confusion about her identity. After 33 years of remaining nameless, El Dorado Jane Doe was finally reunited with her family. Benton County Jane Doe. On May 7, 1990, Benton County Sheriff's Office responded to a call regarding the discovery of charred human remains located in the remote area of Maysville, Arkansas. When investigators reached the location, a grisly scene lay before them. An autopsy revealed that they belonged to a female whose age ranged between 25 and 35. She'd been shot before her killer had poured gasoline on her and set her on fire. A facial reconstruction was attempted in an early effort to identify the poor victim, but given the extensive damage, it was not possible. No other details about her could be gleaned from her remains due to the deteriorated condition. She was referred to as Benton County Jane Doe and laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Bentonville Cemetery in Arkansas. For years, detectives in Benton County Sheriff's Office worked diligently on the case. Over the years, evidence was submitted multiple times to the Arkansas Crime Lab, but every effort hit a dead end and the woman remained unidentified. In 2008, forensic scientists at the University of North Texas successfully developed a mitochondrial DNA profile from the remains. The profile was entered into the NamUs, and dental records were compared to numerous missing people, but their attempts proved fruitless, and the case froze over once again. Their efforts finally paid off when, on April 22, 2021, the Arkansas Crime Lab shipped portions of the remains to Othram for testing. 5 months later, Othram successfully developed a more complete DNA profile for the victim. Then, on August 11, 2022, Othram's in-house genealogy team identified a distant relative. Detectives from the Benton County Sheriff's Office got in contact with a relative of the victim, who then voluntarily provided a family history, including names of the close relatives. Using the family tree, detectives soon tracked down another relative who had information about a missing female family member. In September 2022, DNA from the possible relative was collected and compared with the DNA of the unidentified victim. The results came back, positively identifying a genetic match. They were finally able to identify the woman as 28-year-old Donna Sue Nelton. After 32 years, Benton County Jane Doe finally got her name back. But her killer's identity was still a mystery. Detectives had been able to pinpoint Donna's last sighting to be in the fall of 1989 through further investigation. George Alvin Bruton, her boyfriend at the time, was being investigated by the federal authorities for multiple offenses. He was on the FBI's most wanted list in 1979 for 3 months after he wounded 2 officers in Utah and took 2 families hostage. Additionally, he'd been linked to several murders in the Kansas City area and had multiple convictions for bank robbery, burglary, and auto theft. He was captured after being wounded in a shootout in Fort Smith in 1980. After his parole in 1988, Bruton faced investigation again in July 1989 for multiple crimes. Bruton, along with an associate, was spotted disposing black trash bags into a dumpster in North Kansas City in September 1989. Those bags, containing Donna's personal belongings, were later retrieved by FBI agents. Donna's vehicle was also located inside a storage unit known to be used by Bruton. Bruton violated parole and was convicted after he was identified as the leader of a multi-state drug ring. In July 1990, FBI received information that Bruton had confessed to murdering a woman named Donna over threats to expose his illegal activities. Donna's remains were claimed to be on a property in Ozark County, Missouri, which was owned by Bruton. After obtaining a search warrant for the land, FBI agents searched for 4 days, but no evidence was recovered. Eventually, Bruton was given a life sentence on drug-related offenses. Donna's family revealed that both Bruton and Donna Sue passed through Benton County on occasion. It was near to the place where Donna's skeletal remains were found. They also visited an RV park called Pine Island Resort, located in Jay, Oklahoma. A flyer for the Pine Island Resort was found at the crime scene, along with the skeletal remains in 1990. Unfortunately, he could not be charged with Donna's murder, as he had died in 2008 in prison. After talking to Donna's family, detectives decided to officially close the cold case.